Good morning and welcome. My name is Laura de Boisblanc, and I'd like to welcome you to the second half of the Morning of Prayer and Awareness. Those of us in Wallace Hall have already said the Stations of the Cross for Asylum Seekers together, and we're glad that the people on live stream can join us now. At September's Oh, I didn't see you. Father Yesalona is here in the back, Father. Well, welcome to you. Well, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you. Oh, I think I'll just leave this. I think that holding it will make me even more of a klutz. Anyway, at September's, St. Ignatius Loyola had a Welcome Back Sunday in September, and our Ignatian social justice team decided to work on the plight of the refugee. When I mentioned that to Father Danny Gustafson, he advised me to email his best friend, Father Brian Strassburger, who was just starting a ministry in Brownsville, Texas, and Reynosa, Mexico. So I emailed. The two Jesuits at the border, Fathers Brian and Louie, invited us to come and see. In January, 5 of us went. We call ourselves the Friends of the Border. Two of the Friends of the Border are in the audience. Dolores, who also provided all the delicious treats that we have, and Father Danny, who led us in the Stations of the Cross. Dolores will also offer the microphone to you when we have our question and answer. It's important for you to wait till you have the microphone before you speak, because although we could hear you in here, the people on the live stream will not be able to hear you. So those two are there, and then the other three who went to the border are Terry Quinn, Christine Myers, and I went. We have also with us Dr. Leo Gardaco, Fordham University professor, who is joining us on the panel. For today's discussion, we'll listen to a video from Fathers Brian and Louie discussing shelters at the Mexican border and U.S. policies affecting the border. The newly ordained priests went to Brownsville, Texas 8 months ago to figure out how to set up a ministry to serve refugees. Then we'll have a short Q&A. We'll have a short Q&A after every speaker. Terry Quinn will be the next speaker, and he'll talk about why the migrants are coming here, followed by a Q&A. And then we'll listen to a video clip from Rafael Cortez, airline pilot and frequent Reynosa visitor. Fathers Brian and Louie say that Rafael is instrumental to the success of our ministry and a great friend to us. There'll be another Q&A. Then Christine Meyer, ISJ member and scribe for Friends of the Border, will talk about the encampment and what life is like there, followed by a Q&A. And finally, Dr. Leo Gardaco, Fordham University Theology professor, will reflect on how migration challenges what it means to be church here in the United States, followed by our final Q&A. Then we'll have closing comments. Father Danny will lead us in a closing prayer, and we hope that you will stay for coffee, cookies, and conversation. So, we gave a small time slot to each speaker and to each Q&A. That allows us to cover a lot of ground, and I'll help people stay on track. So let's start with the video from Fathers Brian and Louie, the two Jesuits at the border. But before we start, let me just say one thing, that Father Louie refers to Sister Norma. Sister Norma Pimentel is the Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. She has been praised by Pope Francis and others for her work with refugees and immigrants. In 2014, Sister Norma started the Humanitarian Respite Center in McAllen, Texas. On our first full day at the border, we visited Reynosa in the morning and the Respite Center in the afternoon. Before each Mass in Reynosa, Father Brian says, "God is with you in your suffering, and there is plenty of suffering." In the more hopeful Respite Center in McAllen, Father Brian starts each Mass in a relaxed way, asking people to raise their hand if they're from El Salvador or Honduras or Guatemala. So would you start, please?
Hello, I'm Father Brian Strassburger.
And I'm Father Louie Hotop. We are two Jesuit priests here in Brownsville, Texas, and we're excited to be at least virtually with you today for a few moments to talk about our ministry and the great work that the group from St. Ignatius did while they were here with us.
We very much enjoyed their visit and the time spent, and we've appreciated greatly the continued support of that group that came down here and also the parish at large that have supported our ministry in a variety of ways, including with donations that we've been using to help support the migrants who are living basically in a plaza in northern Mexico. One of the things that they asked us to do on this brief video was to give you some updates about what's going on down here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of policy, and then Louie's going to talk a little bit about the reality of shelters along the border. So just to launch right into it, a big part of the reason why there's so many people in northern Mexico is because of Title 42, which is basically a health code that was implemented at the start of the pandemic that did not allow people to enter the United States to start an asylum process or to make an asylum claim because the US deemed that it was a public health risk letting people into the country that way. And so that has continued to hold force even a couple years later. And because of that, a lot of people who are coming from Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they try to enter the US and ask for asylum and to enter the asylum process and are basically expelled immediately into northern Mexico. We would encourage people to continue to advocate to an end to Title 42, but we are optimistic that some current talk, some of the rumors along the border and in policy positions are that might be revoked as soon as the month of April. Obviously, the pandemic is at very low levels. We've seen significant decrease in the United States, so we're optimistic that that change might occur sometime soon. In the meantime, there have been people who have been getting across and getting to the US. We've seen an uptick since the start of this year of people leaving the plaza and getting allowed access to enter the United States through a procedure called humanitarian parole, which basically allows people who have severe medical needs to enter the country for a fixed amount of time. It might be 6 months or maybe a year. Permission to come in the US to have their medical situation evaluated. So that could include someone that's in a late stage of pregnancy, but then also other physical and even psychological ailments. Well, it turns out when people are living in a plaza in tents for months and months at a time, there are various physical and mental afflictions that might grant them reason to be granted humanitarian parole. So we've been seeing as many as 20 to 50 people a day, probably more around 20 a day or so, getting out of northern Mexico into the United States. Once in the country under humanitarian parole, there are methods to get the advice of a lawyer to enter the asylum process, which is what many of them will attempt to do. So that's a little bit of an update from the policy standpoint. Now I'll turn over to Louie to talk a little bit about the shelters.
Thanks, Father Brian. The shelters more shelters are emerging along the border. There's estimated to be about 2,000 to 3,000 people in the plaza at the moment. And those people are there because the shelter capacity on this part of the border is totally maxed out. So there is no room at the shelters at the moment, and yet NGOs and different humanitarian groups have responded by trying to expand different shelter opportunities. And so one is about to open in the next few weeks. It's called Senda de Vida 2, Senda Dos, and it's run by Pastor Hector, a good friend of ours, who has his own shelter already. And this will hopefully be able to house up to 3,000 people. So it could potentially house all the people who are in the plaza. And they'll still be in tents most likely, but they'll have the security of a wall around the shelter. They will have facilities like bathrooms and some offices to meet with doctors or lawyers or other humanitarian workers. So it's definitely going to be a much more planned out space, a space that's much safer than the plaza, and hopefully a good access point for humanitarian resources. Whereas some humanitarian resources have been hesitant to come into the plaza because of safety concerns, in a shelter like Senda de Vida, it's much easier to access, much easier to control who's coming in and out. So that's definitely something we're looking forward to. On the US side, we're seeing an increase in numbers who are crossing. Like Father Brian was saying, the humanitarian parole opportunities and other avenues are emerging. And if Title 42 goes down, then that number will increase even more, most likely. So we're seeing preparation on this side. Sister Norma has been renovating her space and is expanding a new kitchen right now, and one space is already renovated. So they're definitely preparing for changes to come this summer and preparing for greater numbers. It's just a matter of when one policy might, when Title 42 in particular might end, and what that might mean for the current migrant situation. We're also seeing other shelters emerge along the border as well, in Matamoros and in different parts of the valley. So definitely hope on the horizon for people, especially those who are stuck in a place like the plaza. You know, like, we get used to it. We get used to seeing it, and in reality, it's just not a good place to be. So anywhere that is safer, anywhere that's more contained, more controlled, more organized, is going to benefit people, we think, in the long run.
This has been a lot of information for us to deliver to you, but we wanted to give you some of these updates that we thought might be helpful. And we'll leave it to the rest of the group to share some great stories of their experience down here. But we can't end without extending that invitation to everyone participating in this call. If you want to learn more about this experience, there's no better way than to have your feet on the ground and to walk with the migrants in the space that they occupy. So we'd just like to extend that invite. Come and see.
Thank you.
Well, we have a Q&A right now. Obviously, you can't ask questions of the two priests, but if you ask two hard questions that we can't answer, we'll email them and ask. Anyway, the most important part he ended with was come and see, right? It made a huge difference to us. We went, and we hope some of you will go. Would anyone like to raise a question? Dolores will hand you the mic if you would. Oh, we have one.
Are you looking for someone people with certain skill sets, like Spanish language skills? So you're just looking for people to do just basic things, handing out food, that kind of thing. Is that right?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that was my first question too. I can't speak a word of Spanish. Now I've had, 2 months or so of Duolingo. I don't know if that makes me more paranoid about what I don't know about Spanish than what I do. And when I was down there, a woman wanted to practice her English on me. And people will translate. She was telling me a story that was hard for me to understand some part of it, and I asked Father Danny to translate what she wanted. So no, what they want is somebody they want to see somebody who wants to listen to them, right? And even if they don't, you can tell a lot by body language too. You don't have to know the exact words, and somebody will translate for you. We went a different day to Reynosa again with a woman who said that she wanted people to listen to their asylum stories, and I said, well, that's not me. But they said it in Spanish, and then they translated to English, and yes, that was me and all the other 5 people who went. So I'm glad you asked that question. There's no language barrier. There's no age barrier. I think I'm the oldest one who went. It's not a problem.
And the smile is a warm smile is the international language that everyone understands. We learned that quickly.
And if I could just, is this on? Okay, if I could just follow up on one thing that you said about sort of helping. We certainly did some quote unquote work. We packed some bags for migrants who were going on their way. We helped to distribute some supplies. But I think at least for me, it was most important just to witness, to listen to their stories and to be there as a witness to be able to bring those stories back. So yes, the working is part of it, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you. Next we have Terry to tell us about the migrants that he met in Reynosa. That was a perfect lead-in. Christine, thank you.
Good morning again. When I was a young man in high school, one of the first books I was assigned was to read Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy. I read of the iconic historical figures who merited attention in the book, people like Sam Houston, Robert Taft, Daniel Webster. And through my life, ever since then, I've thought, there are other people in the world who are profiles in courage. I'd like to share with you now, for the next few minutes, the lives of people I met in Reynosa. This is painful. Let me share with you lives of people like Angelina and Angie, Maria, Petrona. These are 4 women who left their farms somewhere in the mountains of Guatemala. They did not know each other when they began. They could not even speak Spanish. They could not even communicate among each other because the barriers were so severe. They all spoke some Mayan dialect. When they left, they told us the story, a similar story, of contracting with a coyote. And the coyote charged them several $1,000s. The coyote put them in a large tractor trailer with 200 people. They then embarked on a ride, several days, 1 bottle of water for each of the 200 people. Begin your 7 days with that. They continued to explain to us why they had to leave. Angie, one of the women, she told us that her husband left her after the birth of her son, Edwin, who also, at age 6, is a profile in courage. She and Edwin were forced to work on a farm. When they could not pick crops fast enough, they were beaten numerous times. Edwin, by now age 4, was threatened with kidnapping by a drug cartel. At this point, Angie made a horrible mistake. She contacted the police, who gave her no protection. She had no choice but to leave if she wanted to live. Besides the tractor trailer, their journey to Reynosa included a bus ride and a harrowing trek through the Sonoran Desert, where the heat can be as high as 120 degrees by day and as low as 50 degrees at night. As an aside, in his book, the author Jason De Leon, I have it here, he describes scenes of migrants sleeping on top of each other for warmth, not next to each other. De Leon also describes other events of migrants drinking urine to stave off dehydration, which means if you are dehydrated, you are going to die alone in the desert. De Leon also describes others who drink from the trowels of disease-ridden cattle water with insects drinking from the same trowel. These 4 Mayan women banded together, and after all of this and at least 1 robbery attempt, they made it to Reynosa, frightened, scared, dehydrated, suffering their own PTSD, and no male figure to protect them. They grew more fearful. As Angie, Petrona, Maria, and Angelina each told their stories, and this is painful, they cried uncontrollably, shaking, as they recounted their desert experience. Even now, there is emotion among us. Angie went on to explain her desperation and fear of living on the streets of Reynosa. She decided to enter the United States by whatever means she could. She borrowed another several $1,000s, contacted another coyote who put her and Edwin in a rubber inner tube, where they proceeded to paddle their way across the Rio Grande River to Texas, where they were immediately picked up by border police, arrested, and charged with illegal entry, trespass. She now has a criminal record that may be used against her if and when she crosses again. In recent weeks, update, we have learned that Angie is seriously considering a return trip through the desert once again and home to Guatemala. She is tired, she is depressed, she is worn out. Angie's dilemma is certainly an existential dilemma. Stay in the limbo of Reynosa with no guarantee of safe entry to the United States, or return home to Guatemala where she fears further violence, assault, and even death. And her son Edwin may surely be sold to pay the debt she owes these unscrupulous criminals. These stories of Angie, Angelina, Petrona, and Maria may never earn a chapter in a book, much less a Pulitzer Prize-winning book like Profiles in Courage. But I hope you will keep alive in your heart these wonderful people. All of us today, we are all committed to keeping their stories alive. I personally feel committed to keeping alive this story of Edwin. I've been an educator for more than half a century, and I still am involved in the field of education. That afternoon when we met little Edwin, he drew art scroll, he hugged me, and I thought to myself, what future does he have? You come to my apartment up the block, and you will see Edwin's work hanging next to the other masterpieces of my 4 grandchildren. I'm committed to keeping the memory of this child alive. We will do that. A couple of other things. Among the other people we met, this was touching. They gave us scapulars. I have 2, if you are committed and you're interested in keeping the memory of these people, these 4 profiles in Courage alive, I have 2 scapulars. Take it and wear it. And every day, you look at it, you'll think as I do. Edwin and these 4 wonderful profiles in Courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? And wait for the mic if you do. Nick?
I know that there are other people seeking asylum, migrants, who are not only from Central America, that make their way through Central America, that come from Bangladesh, parts of Africa, other places where they've experienced, violence in their home country, and had no other choice in terms of escaping continued physical violence and death threats to make their way to the United States. But have they, many of them do come through there. I wonder if you've met anyone there at the border who had made the journey from wherever they were, from somewhere in Asia or Africa, and the journey to the U.S. was through the route that many of the migrants from Latin America have met emergency. How did anyone in your travels, at least you work there, where that was the case?
There are people who come from throughout the world finding ways into the United States. There are people who come from throughout the world finding ways, legally, illegally, to enter the United States. I think the most difficult path to come into the United States is through the southern border, because it is a center of political activity on both sides. My understanding is that just recently, if you read the New York Times, there was a family from India. They lost their jobs as school teachers. Some of you are nodding, you read the story. They came through Canada. They froze to death. And I understand also people are coming from Russia. They come through various routes to come to the United States. But most of the federal law enforcement resources are focused on the southern border.
Okay. Thank you. I think we will go on to the next clip that we have from Rafael. Rafael is an airline pilot, and he walked with us from the Texas side of the border into the encampment at Reynosa. He accompanies Father Brian and Louie when they visit the people of Reynosa as often as he can. So I want to emphasize that he's an airline pilot and not a not a priest or anything like that. Just thanks.
The man in search of God will find him everywhere. Hello, my name is Rafael Cortez. Yep, I'm the one in the middle. I was told I only have 10 minutes to tell you why I go to Reynosa as much as I can. Well, I'm sorry if I disappoint you, but it won't take me that long. When I was asked to be part of this panel, I had no idea why. But it all began when Father Brian, Father Louie, and myself all moved to the Rio Grande Valley down in South Texas 8 months ago. Inspired and invited by the Holy Spirit, this journey took us to a place called La Plaza in Reynosa, Mexico. The people that live in the plaza, some calls them immigrants, others calls them asylum seekers. But now, 8 months later, we call them family. The first time you go and bring the little you can, you will find yourself empty-handed very quick. Then it's when you find the true meaning of Corinthians 13:13. But the most important of all three is love. They hug you, they share their problems and their hopes. You can see the change in their face once you share with them a little bit of love. Mother Teresa said, "Spread love wherever you go. Let no one ever come to you without living happier." There is this 7-year-old kid with a speech impediment. His name is Eric, but he gives the most beautiful hugs that can only come from God. He doesn't care what you're doing, whether you're just arriving at the plaza or celebrating Mass. He will run to you and hug you. Another day, the lady asked, "Please, can you follow me?" She took me in front of a tent and said, "There is a mom with her daughter living in that tent. And when it rains, everything gets wet." All she wanted was to see if we can get a better tent for her neighbor. Then I asked her, "Where do you live?" And when she pointed to her tent, it was as bad as her neighbor's. And that's how they are, always helping others in more need. In Mass, you will see a little girl that during the Our Father, she closes her eyes and raises her little arms in the same position of Miguel Perot when he was about to be executed, praying the Our Father with the same intensity that John Paul II prayed. When Father Brian and Father Louie celebrate Mass, the altar is a cafeteria table. But when you look up, you can see the duct tape repairing the tarp, so the cafeteria stays dry when it rains. But when you look with an open heart, you will see a cross. In the plaza, I was baptized by someone as the guy that follows the fathers. And I couldn't be more proud of my new name. For me, one of the greatest achievements in my life. We don't come here to give. We come here to receive. Because once you come and see, your life will never be the same. On the first Jesuit Border podcast, Bishop Flores said, "Jesus made friends with the poor, and I have this image of final judgment. I go up the doors and knock, and St. Peter is there, and he has all the poor behind him, and he looks at them after I am there, and he says, will any of you speak on his past? And my brothers and sisters, that's why I go to Reynos as much as I can. To see God's face, to feel God's hugs, to remind myself that three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of this is love. Come and see, and you will find God in all things.
Rafael say that he comes to Reynosa as much as he can to see God's face, to feel God's heart, to remind himself that three things last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Before I saw this video, I knew that Rafael had renewed his marriage vows at the Reynosa altar, and now I understand why. So there are any questions and answers? Questions or comments? And wait for Dolores to hand you the microphone, please. Okay, in that case, we'll go right on to Christine, who would you please tell us what life is like at the encampment?
Sure. Hopefully this is close enough. So when I first met Father Brian by phone, I said, well, how can we help you? How can we at St. Ignatius help you? Can we send you some money? Can we maybe gather a collection of shoes or clothes and send it to you? And he said, read the Gospel of John. When the disciples asked Jesus, where are you staying? He said, come and see. And so I invite you to share what we saw. I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And I'll just walk you through what it was like to be at the camp. We walked into the encampment. You saw on the video from Rafael, the jungle of tents. Mostly blue, but lots of different colors. Jerry-rigged, ripped, taped, tarps over top. No rhyme or reason, no order. And in between the tents, mud. It was raining on the day we were there, rained the night before. Puddles of standing water, lots of uneven surfaces. So walk with me in between those tents, getting to the middle of the camp, through the mud, through the puddles. Watch out, don't trip. Oh, watch out. There's somebody's blanket sticking out of the tent. Don't step on it. That's their blanket to sleep with tonight. And we go into the big tent. You saw the pictures in Raphael's video where Mass is held. And Father Brian and Father Louie introduced that they've brought some friends from New York. And at this point, I'm feeling really shy, very uncertain. I learned Spanish in high school and college, but it's very, very rusty. I'm feeling pretty uncomfortable. But I take a deep breath, and I turn to a migrant standing next to me, and I say, hola, yo soy Cristina. And before you know it, I've met Veronica and her 8-year-old daughter, Isabel. They arrived yesterday to the plaza. They're even more shy and even more uncertain and even more scared than I am. And then I meet Fernando, an 11-year-old, with his mother. Fernando, on his trip to the camp, was held for ransom by the drug cartels for several days. His mother had to rustle up a lot of money for her. Now she's worried because Fernando has asthma, and she has no idea how she's going to get another inhaler. She's got one, and she hopes he doesn't have an attack. And then I met Katerina, who's about my age, who has Parkinson's and walks with a cane. And as hard as it is for me to walk around the mud and the puddles, it's really hard for her. She's overwhelmed by the challenges that face her. And then I meet Esperanza. Esperanza's name means hope in Spanish. And Esperanza invites me to come to the tent where she sleeps. It's a larger tent with a bunch of cobbled together bunk beds, I guess you would call them. And I noticed that a whole bunch of people are sleeping in the middle of the day, and I asked her in my broken Spanish, why are they sleeping? They won't be able to sleep at night. And she tells me it's much too dangerous for women to sleep at night in the camp. They have to trade off sleeping because there are unscrupulous men who come around and are going to take advantage of them. And so I talk to them and hear their stories, and we all talk to the migrants. And before you know it, the fear and the uncertainty that gripped me when I first came into that tent leads to the sharing of stories and leads to laughter and hugs. I'm sorry, like Terrence, it's emotional to think back to the trip. A few minutes later, Father Brian from Louie announced that Mass has started. You saw the picture, it was a simple altar, no stained glass, no glorious choir like we have at St. Ignatius. Just men and women and children kneeling in the mud and singing a song that we've heard over and over again. The English translation is, Lord, with your eyes set upon me, gently smiling, you have spoken my name. And that's what we're trying to do here today, speak their names. And in that Mass, the despair, the trauma, as Terry said, the PTSD, the trauma that is in that camp is overwhelming. But when they prayed and when they sang, that turned to hope. And then we walked around the camp to one of the cocinas, the kitchens, where they cook. And this brings a smile to my mind, and to my heart to remember Claudia and Xiomara. They're also migrants. There's some of the cooks in the camp, and they have very big personalities. You see every kind of person there, just like you see every kind of person in any community. And Claudia would not let us pass by before insisting that we share a meal with her. The same meal that the migrants are eating. What is the meal? It's ramen noodles served from an old decrepit beer cooler. And she shoveled it onto some plates, and we ate them. In their poverty, he showed us generosity. So when Father Brian and Father Louie invited us to come and see, what did I see? I saw a transformation. I saw transformation right in front of my eyes. Fear into love. Despair into hope. Poverty into generosity. And I saw that transformation, yes, by us, we certainly brought things, and Father Brian and Father Louie certainly brought things, but I saw it from the migrants themselves. And they inspired me by their faith. It absolutely puts into practice, into action, the St. Francis prayer. Where there's despair, let me bring hope. Where there's hatred, let me bring love. Where there's darkness, light. And where there's sadness, joy. And it reminds me back to what Father Brian said to us when we first talked to him. Come and see. And what was come and see? That was an answer that Jesus gave. And what was the question? The question was, Jesus, where are you staying? And that's what I saw in Reynosa. I saw Christ. And now that I've seen the face of Christ, I can't unsee that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. If anyone has a question or comment, can you wait for Dolores to give you the microphone?
Can you elaborate a little more on the safety issues? I mean, this is so concerning that a situation is allowed to exist where women are afraid to sleep at night.
Yeah, I mean, the migrants they've organized themselves in a lot of different ways, and one of the ways is that some of the men do patrol, some of the good men, there are a lot of good men there, of course, patrol at night. But the drug cartels are very, very active in that part of Mexico. And they prey on these migrants, and they prey on these migrant women. There are kidnappings out of the camp. And quite honestly, I think we can all say we saw it and felt it as well. There was a day when we were walking in the streets of Reynosa with Sister Alma, who introduced us to the migrants that Terry was talking about. And we walked back towards the camp, and she said, "Don't go. We're going to say goodbye to them some distance away, because we don't want people to see us with them. That may make those women more vulnerable because they know that they've received something." And we definitely saw some pretty, say, sketchy people who were staring us down. And at one point in time, Sister Alma said, "Come on, let's go. We're out of here." So there is, when you have vulnerable people, unfortunately, you have people who are going to prey on them, and it's not that hard to figure out who the vulnerable ones are, especially when, for example, the people who are expelled from the U.S. come back across the border. When Border Patrol sends them back, and because they've been in U.S. detention, sounds bizarre, but their shoelaces are taken away. So they walk across with sneakers without shoelaces. And so if you're a cartel member who wants to know who's the most vulnerable among the vulnerable, who knows nobody yet in the camp, all you have to do is look for the people without the shoelaces. So, yeah, the safety issue. And that's why Father Brian and Father Louie were talking about the NGOs are working frantically to set up a new camp that at least will have a fence or a wall around so that can be some access control. Right now, it's just literally a plaza in the middle of a town. No access control whatsoever. Yeah.
I'd just also say that one of those stories too, which made the hair on my head stand up, is that when we were speaking to the Mayan women, they told us that the night before 2 women had given birth in the camp in the middle of the mud, and they all helped each other in this. I mean, it's just, to me, something that's so foreign to think about, and yet it's the reality that exists there.
Joanne.
Sorry, I want to say thank you. I think it's really brave to be so emotional and share such stories. I appreciate Terry and Christine both. I wonder, I know you guys encourage the coming and seeing. But I know you also think about the larger question and the policy, and one of the things that really confuses me is why we don't pressure our government to allow the UN to set up refugee camps, right? Like, the problem with the makeshift camps is always security. I mean, we see it all over the world when that happens. We know that the UNHCR can set up camps. Unfortunately, it's a tragedy, but it's time to admit that we're there. But I know that the government of the country that has the camp needs to invite the UN. So why has the U.S. not invited the UN to put a couple good camps on the border? Because this problem is not going away. And the way what's happening now is a hot mess. And the NGOs are doing a great job, but they can't possibly continue like this. It's ridiculous. So we just need to admit that we're not willing to do it and let the UN come and do what they do the world over and knock it off. But I don't know how the fathers would feel about that, or other people who have done it. Maybe my analysis is too naive. But.
Yeah, and I'll take a stab at it. I don't have one answer is it's not in the U.S., it's in Mexico. But having said that, the issue is still the same. And there's very poor people, we met them too, who are living on the US side of the border in what's called colonias we also visited and are also preyed upon. The only thing that I can say is that what I learned is that it is a problem with layer upon layer upon layer. And I'm still learning. You know, the Title 42 certainly is a huge part of kind of the current issue, and it's possible that Leo, having a bigger picture, might be able to answer some of this. But what I have learned is that it is very complicated and very complex, and maybe purposefully so.
Sure, go right into it, very close.
I'm going to add to Christine. I think also we have to realize there's a lack of political will. And that is, we all know that immigration to this country is festering with severe partisan political deadlock. Immigrants don't vote. And if you look at Texas, it's an anti-migration state, along with others. There's no political benefit for the current administration in Washington to actively engage and pursue this. That may change, and I understand that there are efforts being made this very day to encourage the administration to adopt a more flexible, tolerant, open attitude. And as Father Brian said earlier, there is some indication that Title 42 and its restrictions may be reduced in the next month or so. Stay tuned for all of us to watch that.
Okay. So now we'll hear from Professor Leo Gardaco, originally from El Salvador. He's worked in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands with parishes, dioceses, and NGOs who respond to the needs of persons migrating through the desert wilderness and attempting to survive in the U.S. Leo earned his PhD in systematic theology and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame. Can you move that closer, please? Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's quite a privilege to be in the midst of such palpable experience, and I guess blessings as to discern what to do with it. Before getting into my remarks, I just want to say the U.S. has pressured the UN and Mexico not to set up camps. That is the political will. The UN wants to set up camps. The U.S. will not permit such a thing. So, my remarks are going to be more on the theological, we would say maybe ecclesial register, and then we'll have time to speak, about either the remarks or what may be going on at the border. So, from the symbolic Mass in Lampedusa at the beginning of his papacy in 2013, which drew attention to the deaths of persons trying to reach Europe from the north of Africa, deaths that now surpass 23,000 persons, to his most recent message for the 107th World Day of Migrants and Refugees in 2021, Pope Francis has placed forcibly displaced persons at the heart of the Church. The centering of that 2013 Lampedusa homily was around fratricide, the act of one sibling killing another, and of blood crying out to God. And fratricide grounds all his later reflections that, like scaffolding, have led to his last major encyclical on social friendship, Fratelli Tutti. So from fratricide to Fratelli Tutti, from fratricide to fraternity, that is the arc and the horizon of his papacy and the challenge for the Church and for our humanity. So in the time that I have, I would like to reflect on the ecclesial task that is before us if we are to more efficaciously act against the normalization of the killing of whole peoples who were forced to migrate. And let me begin by accounting for my own social location within the dislocation that marks global migration. About 30 years ago, in late September 1991, when I was 9 years old, I left my mountain village of Chalatenango, El Salvador, saying goodbye to a loving grandfather whom I would never see again. I journeyed with my mother, whom I had come to know 6 months prior, for she had been in the U.S. since I was 4 years old, a necessity brought about by the U.S.-funded Civil War. She returned to get me out before I would be taken to fight at the ripe old age of 10, because that's when kids were being taken by both sides of the Civil War to ensure that the war had an unlimited supply of disposable soldiers. And in those 5 years of maternal absence, I had learned to call my aunt my mother and lived into anthropological truths that are emphasized by Latinx theologians, that our culture is profoundly relational, but also that by necessity what constitutes our immediate family is fluid, created and recreated according to need, like you see in the camps. Those of us marked by forced migration often come from contexts that echo the book of Lamentations. You may say that we are a resilient people, but that could be a fancy way of saying that we have learned to survive and adapt at a cost. Like so many biblical stories, the stories of migrants, refugees, and all who seek some form or another of asylum, from the Greek asilon, meaning inviolable or unplunderable, our lives are literature of survival that seeks the possibility of life beyond violence and plunder. Biblical scholar Todd Linnefelt says that, quote, "The fundamental fact of any literature of survival is that something or someone that is dead or ought to be is still alive," close quote. Forcibly displaced persons carry that paradox of living with a heightened awareness and memory of death in life and life in death, of the humanity of whole generations being plundered and violated. Ours are stories of children having to be smuggled across countries, too often sent away on their own across continents for the future of the family, or simply with the agonizing hope of sparing them a death before their time. Our stories are laments, what biblical scholar Kathleen O'Connor calls, quote, "prayers that erupt from the wounds, burst out of unbearable pain," close quote. But these wounded words, these prayers that erupt from the theft of humanity amid histories of colonialism, are also an epiclesis that invokes the spirit of the wounded word in a political act of hope in the God of the living and the God of the dead. And so forcibly displaced persons do not only say prayers on the way, which they do, but are an incarnate prayer on the way, a testimonio, a testimony in the flesh, crossing the arid landscape of humanity with dreams and visions of another world in this history. Their very presence is an eschatological sign of the future that comes toward us, that is coming toward us, and of the God that faithfully pitches a tent with them on their journey in the border and beyond. This past month, we have witnessed about 1 million Ukrainians displaced every week, most of them women and children, and million more staying within the country internally displaced. In a single month, the number of forcibly displaced persons has increased at a rate not seen since World War II. And it will not be long before the global number of displaced persons surpasses 90 million, which is double the number 10 years ago. In 2012, 45 million seemed like a staggering figure. But this wound of modernity only festers with time. As in all forced displacements, people will search for life and protection anywhere, regardless of whether they are accepted or rejected by the state. To Ukrainians, we must add the communities from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Central America, Venezuela, Yemen, Myanmar, Haiti, and the list could go on. And for non-white, non-Christian populations attempting to reach Europe or the United States, the rejection and expulsion is yet one more crucifixion they must endure. These forcibly displaced communities who are on the way reflect what Jesuit theologian John Sobrino from El Salvador calls a primordial holiness. He argues that the victim survivors, the poor of history, do miracles that violate the law, the loss of history. And this is the milagro de sobrevivir, literally the miracle of overliving in a hostile world where nothing facilitates their life, or rather makes it exceedingly difficult for them to have life. Sobrino writes, quote, "The longing to live and to survive in the midst of great sufferings, the decision and the work to make it possible, with limitless creativity, with fortitude, with constancy, defying innumerable difficulties and obstacles. This," he says, "is what we call primordial holiness." It is the kind of holiness or saintliness that is also revealed in the mothers of disappeared migrants who every year make a journey north from Central America with the hope of locating their daughters and sons who had to flee and who were never heard from again. We hosted them in Fordham this past October, and they'll be back next October if your parish wants to have them speak at your parish. And their collective refusal to stop searching for their children, to surrender their dreams of seeing them again, echo that tragic and holy tradition that survives, that overlives in Jewish and Christian scriptures, that of Rachel weeping for her exiled and deported children, refusing to be consoled. And so as church, do we weep for the exiled and deported? This is in fact what Francis asked in his homily in 2013 in Lampedusa. Do we refuse to be consoled? What ought we to do before what Sobrino describes as, quote, the holiness of suffering for wanting to live, close quote. And perhaps as Christians in the U.S., we cannot even begin to comprehend that sacramental reality that is present in all who struggle for life, even unto death. Perhaps that sacramental reality has been rendered illegal beyond recognition. And yet it bears God and is borne by God across deadly borders. It is a wounded reality that can reveal, sanctify, and transform us if we are willing to encounter it and to let it encounter us. Francis's 2021 message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees is titled Hacia un nosotros cada vez más grande, toward an ever wider we. And Francis begins his message with a desire to point out a clear horizon for our common journey in this world, one that can avoid what he calls, quote, an egotistic self-preservation at the cost of others who seek life. He speaks of a horizon of salvation that is marked by a nosotros, a we, at the beginning, and a nosotros, a we, at the end, with the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection at the center of that history. Like Christ, the present of this history is, in his words, quote, broken and fragmented, wounded and disfigured, which holds true not only for society at large, but for the community of the church as well. As we think about the nexus of migration and the church today, let us be clear that a church that is marked more by nationalism than by universality is no longer a Catholic church. Here in the United States, we are living the danger of becoming a church of these United States rather than a church in the United States. A church at the service of the idolatry of national security rather than in communion with the victim survivors of state violence. And what we fail to grasp time and again is that what is gathered by the thousands at the border, and perhaps in the near future by the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, is a referent for the church without whom the church becomes unintelligible, meaningless, a curious oddity of history that itself ceased to believe long ago in God's radical incarnation among the poor and the persecuted. The prize for the white nationalisms and radical individualisms that mark our present ecclesial history worldwide is paid by those others, the foreigners, the migrants, the ones who are caged and forcibly sent away to continue wandering across geographies of inhumanity. In his 2021 message, Francis speaks of the influx of migrants as a missionary frontier, and he does so carefully in light of colonial histories, attentive to what it means to give what he calls un testimonio concreto, a concrete testimony of one's faith that announces salvation in a way that can be understood. He invites a reconstituting or recreation of the human family so that no one is excluded. And I would add a recreation of the church as well. He recognizes that this is an ideal, a prophecy, we could say, the dreams of the old, or perhaps the visions of the young. But he adds, and without qualifications, that, quote, we must all make every effort to break down the walls that separate us, close quote. For we are facing an opportunity to, quote, overcome our fears in the creation of a nosotros, a we. I think the temptation is to interpret the call to break down the walls that separate us simply as metaphorical, figurative language, as a way of speaking about the longing for unity across difference. His words can be easily domesticated, spiritualized, and insufficiently discerned in practice. But what if we read Francis's words from the perspective of those whose lives depend on the tearing down of walls? Would contemplating these words in the shadow of a wall that separates Mexico and the US bring to light the historical density and creativity that is necessary for enfleshing them in the present? Like all exegesis of biblical texts or of reality, we read from our particular locations and our need or lack thereof. But let me make reference to a moment in U.S. and ecclesial history when communities of faith felt called to transgress and cross over their fears, and in the way, I think, forged a new we. 40 years ago, this past Thursday, on March 24th, 1982, on the second anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, churches in the borderlands and across the country declared themselves a sanctuary of God for the oppressed of Central America. Initially, this was referred to as a ministry of sanctuary. And churches, synagogues, convents, monasteries, shelters of various kinds, and private homes throughout the US and Canada literally began to shelter asylum seekers who were being systematically denied asylum by the US government. Through this creative ecclesial network across borders, asylum seekers were brought into the U.S. and protected in these communities until they could safely apply for asylum under an administration that actually recognized the truth of their persecuted reality. And even though only a few Roman Catholic bishops publicly supported this ministry, the people of God, in the greatest sense of this phrase, were literally willing to pay the price for their testimonio of faith. Perhaps you may be thinking that this is something that could happen in the 1980s, but that cannot happen today. You may be right. And yet, it is these ways of thinking that we are invited to overcome, as the eschatological future of nosotros, of a we, comes toward us, shattering the borders that alienate us behind the walls of false security. Toward the end of his 2021 message on migrants and refugees, Francis says, quote, Dios nos pedirá cuentas de nuestras acciones. God will demand an account of our actions. Close quote. What account of the church in the United States will be written in the future as the church's own reason for being is knocking on its doors and gathering at the borders? What account, what story will be told of each of our parishes? I pray that we not lack the ecclesial imagination that is capable of dreaming the dreams of the poor, of the displaced, of the persecuted. For they are bearers of visions of a transformed world. Let me end these remarks with reference to Francis's 2020 message for the Day of Migrants and Refugees, where he proposes 6 pastoral points that are made up of pairs of verbs, which can serve perhaps as a guide for your parish. And so the first one has to know to understand. And he says that knowing comes through an encounter and stories, not simply through statistics. 2, be close to serve. Francis emphasizes that fears and prejudices and an unwillingness to take risks keep us distant. 3, to reconcile, listen. He centers the capacity to listen to the vulnerable, the displaced, and the planet as the beginning of salvation itself. 4, to grow, share. And here he emphasizes, echoing Fratelli Tutti, his last encyclical, that no one is saved alone. 5, be involved to promote. And this requires, he says, reflexivity, so that we recognize that those whom we assist and with whom we journey are, quote, agents in their own redemption, close quote. And his 6th pair of verbs is cooperate to build. And he emphasizes that the reign of God is the common responsibility of all, hopefully all of us who still profess faith in the following of Jesus. And so I leave you with these verbs, and I sincerely thank you for inviting me to reflect with you today on a reality that certainly divides society and the church, but which is also the means for our communion with each other and with Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo. If anyone has a comment or a question, Dolores will hand you the microphone. Nina. Nina, by the way, is how this whole thing came about. And there are lots of ways that this whole thing came about, but Nina and Father Danny were talking at an IVC retreat, and I walked in the room. I hadn't seen Nina, who I love, in 3 months, 6 months, and I said, Nina, and you said, oh, few more things, and then you said, Father Danny, Laura's group is researching the border, and he said, email my friend Father Brian. Please.
Thank you. You're giving far too much credit. I just want to commend you all. I just want to commend all of you for holding this forum. Because it really, stories have to be told. People have to know. You have really put human faces on the issue. That we all, so many of us, just think of it as a piece of news, something in the abstract, but you have put flesh and blood on it. The stories have to be told over and over. And I think we should really seriously think about going and seeing. And there will be practical questions. How do we do that? Who do we contact? I know it was happenstance with Father Danny and myself. For those who don't know, I myself and two other friends went to the border in San Diego. We had a different experience from you. We saw mostly Brazilians, and so they spoke Portuguese. And by the way, the question with regard to the language, now there's these wonderful apps on your phone that you don't even have to read it. You just speak to it, and it translates for you, so that's not at all an obstacle. But I think if I could just suggest that a practical step after this might be, how do we make it practical for somebody who wants to go? And they're practical questions. Can we afford a plane ticket together? Because we volunteers, we would take of our own expenses. Not everybody would be in that position, but maybe most of the people around here would. But then where do I stay? Well, those of us, if we went to San Diego, happen to know a friend who had a house there, so we sit at her house. But there are convents, I think, religious communities in the area, close to the area. It's a question of, contacting them and saying, might you have a bed in your convent for a couple of volunteers? It does require some kind of organizing, but I think the logistics are important because it's what's going to get people to go.
Thank you. We do have someone who's going to do just that. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. So these fine people are our forerunners for beginning program, Mission Immersion. So they have created a whole booklet of their contacts, and we will keep this going. And we wanted to get this going, and we're having a couple of other immersion trips. We're going to a couple of Native American reservations also for Hawaii service. So we're starting. So keep posting to the newsletter. Please read the newsletter, everybody. That's where you can find the information you will need when this comes up. Okay, so we're starting this. This was the first trip, and the logistics and all of that will be through St. Ignatius Loyola and Ignatius Social Justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Yes, Carla.
I was so glad that Joanne brought me, because she knows my story.
Can you put it right next to your mouth?
I said, I'm so glad Joanne told me about this, because she knows my story. 32 years ago, the Catholic worker that I lived in Des Moines got a call from other Catholic workers in Texas. And they said, we have people who need room. And we said, okay. 2 Grinnell students who were fluent in Spanish went to Casa Juan Diego, Houston, Texas. They brought back 5 guys. 3 months later, we went back and got 5 more guys. It was a sanctuary movement that I was so blessed to live through. And in 5 years' time, in Des Moines, we probably had 200-300 guys who lived with us. My 2 youngest boys spoke Spanish before they spoke English, and they did not know that they were Salvadoran or Guatemalan or Honduran. And when people later on would talk to me about immigrants, I'd be like, you don't know immigrants. You don't know what they had to go through to get to this country. You don't know the work that they will do to stay in this country. But it's in my heart. It has been in my heart. I'm glad to see the church is picking up the mantle. I would like to say to Leo, gracias por hablando para la gente, para los salvadoreños, porque mi corazón es muy feliz, porque gentes no recuerdan, gentes necesitan ayuda, ayuda para Dios, ayuda para amigos, ayuda para iglesia. Gracias por hablar.
Gracias.
If I could,
Right up here.
right up to it, okay, I got you. Leo, I would love for you to speak to the arguments that come from the other side, just because these are things that we hear, and the way that at least the nicest, maybe most generous version of that tends to be, well, we have laws, and we have to enforce our laws, and we have to enforce our borders. And so how do we as Catholics, I mean, understanding that we generally support the rule of law, and yet see people who are persecuted who die because of the enforcement of those laws, how do we think of that as Catholics?
Great.
How should we think about that?
Thank you. I think you get to the heart of the conundrum, right? The difficult reality. And I'm not sure that there's a winning in those arguments. But let me just speak a bit to what you do raise there. There are laws, and laws are important. And in the early 1980s, before the sanctuary was beginning, and as it began, some of the key people involved in it were really trying to uphold laws as they understood them. And their argument was, we are, as communities of faith, as churches, as synagogues, we are in fact upholding the laws of humanity that say that you don't just do nothing when persecution happens and when your own government is sending people to their death, to literally a war or situations of war. And of course, this gets into international law and notions that you do not send people to their death, which clashes with domestic laws. And so I think we have to step back and expand the frameworks of how we think of legality or illegality, but then also think historically, how were these laws created? Because no law comes out of a vacuum. It comes out of colonial, racialized histories, where the law has always served those in power, and historically in this country, it is white men. So that's not to say, well, laws don't matter. Quite the opposite. There is an argument to be made that before international law, basic communities, that's a parish, communities of faith, are responsible for upholding the laws of humanity, that even law enforcement cannot just say, I'm following orders. We are held responsible. We have lived in Nuremberg. It is not enough to say, I'm just following the law. And so today in the borderlands, we still have individuals, humanitarian workers, who still provide water and food and medical assistance and, if necessary, shelter, and are threatened with 20 years in prison. Scott Walker, 2 years ago, was one of them, and, went to trial. For Christians, we'll speak Catholics here, I think this is where we have to do a lot of discernment. There is no easy solution, but what I would say is there are laws that may limit what you think you can do, or that may guide what may be a proper response. But before our faith, in light of the gospel, there's different criteria that we have to take into account. That does not resolve the agony, I would say, of living before a cross. That does not resolve the agony of how to move forward. But I think we have to locate ourselves at that nexus. And if a law answers that for you too easily, I think there's a problem here. I think we have to wrestle deeply with that fuzzy kind of messiness of law and faith. And it doesn't mean that one just easily replaces the other. But for each one of us, we have to make that journey of faith. And then as a community, we have to make that journey of faith. And I think only when you walk through it and discern through it do you come to a place where you are able to say for yourselves and utter out loud for yourself the why of the stances or the witnessing that you are taking. But I don't think this is an argument that's kind of won from the outside in. It's from the inside out, and it's a journey, a spiritual journey.
Thank you. Barbara Lee.
I dare to disagree with the theology professor. I'm a lawyer, not a theologian, but I think there is a much simpler answer to the question. There is no moral obligation to obey an unjust law. Most of us here are old enough to remember Catholics and other Christians who rode buses in the segregated South and sat at lunch counters and engaged in other acts of civil disobedience, and then what happened. Moral law, moral behavior ultimately trumps the argument that I only obeyed the law.
Okay. Well, my panelists know that I am, very conscious of the time. And now is the time on my schedule that we're ending the Q&A. But I have some closing comments. First, thanks very much to all the panelists, to Leo and Christine and Terry, and all the parishioners here who helped make this a success, and to Jean, our parish associate, and to Father Danny, our friend of the border, and like our bosom buddy now, right? And Dolores, where are you? Dolores back there. Dolores, who also, not only did she do the mic, but she did the food. That is homemade tea cakes out there, so don't leave without them. So now you're wondering what's next, right? This is, we have to move from here. And so we've begun some other refugee work. And if any of this interests you, please email me, talk to me, and or sign up at the hospitality table when you leave. First, we suggest you accept Father Brian's invitation to come and see Brownsville Reynosa yourself. On the handout sheet, you'll see Jean's email, so you'll email her if you're interested in that. Second is, as you can see by what was raised by Joanne and Carla and Leo, advocacy work is desperately needed. Jesuit Relief Services has an advocacy day on April 5th that involves meeting with your policymakers in your district. Christine and I are participating. We need help with advocacy work, and I hope some of you will consider volunteering. Catholic Charities New York does an enormous amount of work with refugees. So far, we've become involved in 3 areas. Catholic Charities New York hosts legal clinics to help immigrants who are seeking legal status. Marianne Routledge, could you raise your hand, Marianne, please? Thank you. And several other ISJ members are going to help at the legal clinic in Peekskill on May 13th. Catholic Charities New York plans to host legal clinics monthly at various sites in the Archdiocese. Catholic Charities New York provides resettlement activities to New York City immigrants and refugees. Christine has already started to tutor one of the immigrants in English, and she's on the list to be a friend of the court. So we have more items than this on our handout sheet that will give you of upcoming events at St. Ignatius. This is a very active parish, and let's make it more active, right? Build on a good thing. So after Father Danny's closing prayer, please join us for coffee, cookies, homemade tea bread, and conversation. And on your way, be sure to pick out a handout listing the future events. So Father Danny, would you please lead us in a closing prayer?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Gracious and loving God, as we continue our Lenten journeys, we recognize the wounds of your Son in the wounds of our migrant brothers and sisters. As we approach the joy of Easter and the resurrection, we ask you to grant new life to all those in need, especially those seeking a new life and a new home here among us. We ask you to grant us open ears and open eyes and open hearts to be able to receive and respond to your grace and your presence and your guidance, to move us to serve our migrant brothers and sisters and all those in need. We give you thanks and praise for the gift of this time, these words shared, these stories shared, these faces and names shared. We ask you to help us keep them in our hearts and on our minds as we continue discerning how to respond to their needs and the needs of all your people. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Lord.
You're welcome.
Yeah.